Our second scripture is taken from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, verses 25 to 37. Just then, a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You've given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, and when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him. When he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper and said, 'Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?" He said, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." There are some stories that are just too darn familiar. We hear them, have heard them so many times that they just wash right over us and we don't really think about them at all. Most of us react in that way to the story of the Good Samaritan. We have a moral picture of what is a Good Samaritan. It's a term people use. "Oh, he's such a good Samaritan. Did you see the things that person was doing?" We have laws called Good Samaritan laws. If you see someone on the side of the road and you stop to help, they can't sue you because you were being a good Samaritan. We have charities and hospitals named that, the Good Samaritan or Samaritan Hospital. We even have a church fund here called the Samaritan Fund that we use to help people who are in need. Politicians even talk sometimes about Samaritans. Now, it's true that all of the folk who hear and use that term, many of them have no idea what the story is that comes behind it. But those of us who do know that story, who've been sitting here in churches, and we have heard amazing sermons on this passage, at least from one preacher once, we've heard it so many times that the story doesn't have any radical character to it. And we don't hear what that lawyer would have heard as a shocking story. Shocking story. I hadn't even put it together until just now as I was reading it, and for the first time it jumped out at me that when Jesus asked, "Who was the neighbor?" he couldn't even say the Samaritan. He responded by saying, "Oh, the one who showed mercy." He couldn't even say that word. There were historical and cultural and religious reasons behind the hatred between Jews and Samaritans. They both shared a common history. They grew out of the same rootstock, but yet when they looked at each other, they both saw heretics. The Judeans saw the Samaritans as people who had diluted their faith, that they were worse than Gentiles because they had been part of the right rootstock, and they left it behind and allowed their faith to become adulterated They knew the truth and abandoned it. That's what the Judeans thought of the Samaritans. And surprise, surprise, the Samaritans said exactly the same thing about the Judeans. They said that during the exile, when Babylon had taken them and spread them all over the known world, they had adopted some of the ideas and practices of those foreign people and allowed that to become intermingled with their faith. And so they were the ones who no longer held the true faith of their ancestors. They, the Samaritans said, were the real heretics, the ones who had known the truth and abandoned it. So the hatred started there, and it grew and it bubbled, and there was this sense that if you got too close to them, something might rub off. And so they hated each other, period. In a few verses prior to this, Luke, I think, puts these things in close juxtaposition for our benefit. There's an encounter where Jesus and the disciples meet some Samaritans, and Jesus is trying to preach to them, and they reject Jesus. And the disciples, now remember, these are guys who had been learning directly from Jesus. They didn't hear about it from some preacher who went to seminary. They sat at Jesus' feet, and they heard his words. They watched how he lived his life in the world. They saw this man each and every day. They followed him. They lived with him. And when these Samaritans rejected Jesus' message, the disciples come to Jesus and they say, Jesus, should we call down fire from heaven and have them all burn up and die? They didn't get it because they so deeply hated these Samaritans. They so deeply hated these Samaritans that they assumed that was part of God's plan and God's will, and they deserved nothing better than calling down fire from heaven and burning them all up. It's no wonder that in another place in the scripture it tells us Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. They hated each other that much. I was trying to think about that depth of hatred, and we don't really know it in our society like that. The closest I could come is probably some white supremacist groups, like maybe the Aryan Brotherhood or one of those groups that have that depth of hatred for someone else just because. Just because. But in spite of all of the issues of division and all that we have, we don't get this hatred between the Samaritans and the Jews. So that's background material. So a lawyer comes to Jesus and he says, what do I have to do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus asks him a question, well, you tell me. What does the Bible say? And he answers him, and Jesus says, you got it. That's it. Do that, and you have eternal life. And the guy's a lawyer. And lawyers are taught to think in a certain way. It's part of their formation. That's why you go to law school. It's not so you learn book knowledge. It's so you learn how to think like a lawyer. He asks a lawyer's question. Okay, Jesus. So I'm supposed to love my neighbor, but who is it? Who is my neighbor? Where is the line beyond which I don't have to go? Where do my responsibilities end? Who is the one that I need to love? And then by implication, who is the one that I don't have to love because they're not my neighbor? Who is the one that I can ignore or maybe even hate? Jesus never ceases to infuriate. He sidetracks the question and instead answers a slightly different one. He doesn't answer, who is my neighbor? He answers, how can I become a neighbor? What does it look like for me to be a neighbor? And he tells a story. You know the story. You've heard it 1,000 times. And you've heard at least one really good sermon before today on it. A man is traveling from between Jerusalem and Jericho, and he's beaten and robbed and left on the side of the road to die there in the middle of the desert. And the first person to come upon him is a priest, and the priest sees the man, and instead of even looking a little closer to see what's going on, he crosses to the other side of the street and walks on. A bit later, a Levite comes. A Levite is kind of like a director of music.
Thanks a lot.
Sees the man and does exactly the same thing. Crosses to the other side of the street and walks on by. Those two people were representatives of the most faithful, the most committed, the most obedient, the most religious people of the day. Not only did they believe their faith and hold it deeply, they had decided that they had received a call from God to serve God in the temple, to serve God's people. They were the pastors, the Sunday school teachers, the deacons, the church staff, even the pianist of the day. The folk who followed all of the rules, who were models of righteousness. They were the kind of folk, if you wanted your children to know what it looked like to really be religious, you pointed to them. They had given their lives just for that. And both of them passed by. Now, to be fair, we don't know where they were going. We don't know. Maybe there'd been an emergency. There was a car accident, and one of the church members was in the emergency room and not expected to live, and they were trying to get there real fast so they could have a prayer with the person before they died. Or at least to sit with their spouse, with their children, while they were waiting to hear news. Could have been it. Or maybe they were on their way to a wedding or a funeral. And depending on how things were, it could have been that their bookings were tight, and if things didn't get started on time, they wouldn't end on time, and everything would just be a real mess. We don't know what was going on in the background for them. We do know that had they become unclean for any reason, they couldn't have fulfilled their responsibilities as leaders in the temple. And there are ways to become unclean. If they had picked up this man and started to carry him to the hospital and he died en route, they were unclean because they had touched a dead body. If they were picking him up and carrying him and being really, really careful, and all of a sudden he rolled over in their arms and started to bleed on them, they were unclean. And they couldn't fulfill their responsibilities. And maybe there was something else going on. Maybe they were afraid, this is a trap. I don't know that guy's really injured. That's why I'm going over to the other side of the road. I'm getting as far away as possible. I could bend over to try to help him, and someone might jump out from behind the bushes and attack me. I don't know. Or maybe I'll be bent down and trying to help and trying to do the very best I can, and someone else will come along and they'll see this and they'll assume that I was the one who was guilty. That I was the one who robbed him and beat him and put him in that position. I could end up in prison. Better. I'll just cross the other side, mind my own business, keep going. They saw this injured man on the side of the road, and they saw danger. They saw distraction. They saw interruption. They saw everything except a man who needed their help and to whom they could be a neighbor. Along comes the Samaritan. Now, if you had been standing in the crowd at that point and Jesus gets to that and he says, and along comes a Samaritan, everybody would have gone, "Sss." Or they would have shook their head, and the first thought might have been, that's the robber. That's the one. Now the story's going to get good. He's going to get caught, and he's going to get his comeuppance. We don't know where the Samaritan was going either. We don't know anything about, except the person was a hated Samaritan. Could have been a wealthy business person Could have been a homeless person. We don't know. Could have been someone who had more resources than we can imagine and literally could have done anything for that hurt person without really getting involved, all the way down to someone who was giving resources they really didn't have. We don't know. We do know that had the tables been reversed and had it been a Samaritan lying there on the side of the road, and that same priest or Levite or 99% of other Judeans, at least in one stereotypes, they would have looked the other way and continued down the road. We know that had the Samaritan been thinking, he would have known, if I bend over to help and another Judean comes along, I will be blamed. There's no maybes about it. And I could end up getting stoned for this. And here I am in Jewish territory, no one will even blink. No one will even blink. This man lying here on the side of the road is, for all practical purposes, my enemy. Why in the world would I stop to help? But the Samaritan is the hero in Jesus' story. He stops, he bandages the person's wounds, he pours oil and wine on, the best medicine they had at the time. He cares for him, and then he takes him to the innkeeper and he says, here, I've got to get to wherever I'm going. You keep him, and I'll come back through here. And if there's anything more that you need other than this 2 denarii, 2 days' worth of wages, I'll pay it when I get back. Please care for him. He reaches across lines of hatred and prejudice. He ignores social barriers. The Samaritan is the one who looks at the man and sees. He sees one like himself. He sees one who he can love, he can care for, he can show kindness. And so Jesus holds up the Samaritan as the model to follow. The lawyer and we are to be like the Samaritan, the hated other, rather than those righteous Judeans. And he is the model of that because he is the neighbor too. The one who would label him as other. The one who his society would label for him as other. And he reaches out to help. Jesus' message is as clear as it is simple. Be a neighbor to the other. Reach across the barriers. Reach across to the people that your culture and your religion and everything you have been taught from the day you were a little kid to now tells you you should reject. There are some theologians who read this parable and say, if Jesus only said one thing in the whole gospel, this would be enough. That the story of the Good Samaritan sums up the entirety of the good news of God's love. Kurt Vonnegut took a stab at this kind of thinking in his God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, where the main character is writing a speech to give at the baptismal service for his neighbor's twin babies, obviously not Baptists. And here's what the speech says, and you'll excuse me for quoting it accurately. Hello, babies. Welcome to Earth. It's hot in the summer, cold in the winter. It's round and wet and crowded. On the outside, babies, you've got 100 years here. There's only one rule that I know of, babies. God damn it, you've got to be kind. Kind of sums up the Good Samaritan, doesn't it? You've got to be kind. I read this passage, and I have to tell you that when I read this passage, I saw it coming up in the lectionary, and I read it and I went, yes! It was a slam dunk sermon. I knew exactly what I was going to say. We've got ongoing cruelty at the southern border. We've got ICE raids going on today. We've got protests this last Friday evening. We've got ongoing prosecutions happening not only in the United States but also in Italy against people who have saved the lives of undocumented folk. And they're facing prison. A boat captain in Italy is facing 20 years in prison for picking up people who were going to drown in the Mediterranean. My sermon was ready. I had it. And in spite of what would have been a very self-righteous tone, it would have been there. I'm sorry. It still is, isn't it? It would have been a good sermon. It would have been a necessary sermon. It would have been an important sermon. I saw a piece this last week that said, from a writer down, a pastor who has a blog named John Pavlovitz. He said, if your church is not speaking out about these things, it's not Christian. You should go to some other church. Right? He's right. He's right. There aren't easy answers to the crisis that's going on, but it is clear to me beyond a doubt that nobody who calls themselves a Christian, who claims to be following Jesus, can reasonably support these kinds of policies. It's that simple. It really is. Again, that doesn't give answers. That's another question altogether. But we can say, this ain't it. That's where I was going to go with my sermon. And as I was starting to play with that and think about that and start to think about writing my sermon, I started to think about the other. People that our culture says it's okay to hate. It's okay to exclude. It's okay to ignore. And I read some articles written by anti-immigration folk talking about the farm workers that I see so often up in the valley. People bending over, picking strawberries or broccoli or artichokes. And I watch them and I think, oh man, I might last 15 minutes. Maybe. And I don't know anybody who would do that job. Nobody in my circles. You couldn't pay them enough. You could come to me and say, if you do that job for a year, you get $1 million. You know what I would say? I'll be poor. Seriously, I would. I read those articles and I saw the bile that was in them. And yes, yeah, those are people that at least whole sections of our society are saying, you can't ignore them. You know, when someone goes out and puts jugs of water in the desert so someone crossing the desert doesn't die from dehydration and they get arrested for that, that's a problem. And so that was one whole group that our society says, okay, and that one's, I've already been there with this sermon, right? Well, Cheryl and I have started watching the TV series Pose. And it's about transgender folk in New York City in the late 80s, early 90s. It's a heartbreaking and wonderfully authentic and human series. I recommend it. But it had me thinking about transgender folk and that they really are people in our society that it's okay to hate in large degree. And they continue now 30 plus years from when this whole story started in 1982. They're still victims of violence and animosity. And my list started to grow, and I started getting more and more people that are the other. And I was looking at them, and these people that I was listening, they're not really members of my tribe. You know, I don't know a person who picks strawberries. I don't. That's not the circles I move in. I do know some transgender folk, but I don't see them or interact with them very often. It's, first name stuff for the most part. But even though they're not part of my tribe, those aren't the people that challenge me. I could easily see myself opening my heart to any of them. Opening my life to them. And so then I started to ask the really hard question. And I think this is a place where this passage really needs to push me, you can decide for yourself, to ask, okay, who would I exclude? Not just who does the society exclude, and that's bad. That's bad, and deserves sermons, and again, we need to go there. But who would I exclude? Who would I walk by on that road between Jerusalem and Jericho? And obviously the situation's different now. It's a heck of a lot easier for us. I could walk by and I could see someone and I could pull out my cell phone and I could dial 911 and just keep right on going. I don't have to worry about picking anybody up or being inconvenienced by caring for them. Heck, I don't even have to hang around once I've dialed 911. I can be sure someone else is going to come and take care of what needs to be taken care of. But Jesus in this story is not just talking about helping, he's talking about embracing and bringing into your heart. And so just dialing 911 as I walked by wasn't quite enough for me. So I still had to ask the question, are there people who I would not take into my heart? Who I could dial 911 and just keep right on going without giving it a second thought. And I'm embarrassed. I have a list. I'm guessing you would too, but that's yours. And I've realized that if I had been walking down that road and looked over there and lying there in the side of the road in a big heap was a person wearing their MAGA hat, I would have dialed 911 and I would have kept right on going. And I never would have stopped to think about what happened next. I never would have sent best of thoughts or intentions or hopes or anything for that person. And, to take it a little bit closer to home, when I have opportunities to encounter folk who would wear that same hat in my own family and in my larger circles, my general thought is, I'm going to go somewhere else. I got someplace else to be, something else to do. There isn't room in my gut to wrestle with those questions. I do the minimum and move on. And it's hard. And this is built into Jesus' story. It's hard to care for someone else, to welcome them into your heart when they are engaged in behaviors and beliefs that conflict at the deepest levels with your commitments and understandings of what it means to follow Jesus, or even what it means to be a human being. And as soon as I say that, I know that as likely as not, those are unfair stereotypes. They're unfair stereotypes. But that's another thing that goes on my list. But those very folk who are hardest to care for are precisely the folk whom Jesus calls us to care for. And the minimum is never enough. We are called by Jesus to risk, if nothing else, a broken heart for those who would risk nothing for us. To care for those who we perceive as maybe actively working for our own pain. To envision the very best for those who we imagine might throw us under the bus. To stop judging entire categories of people without knowing them as individuals, which I just did in every single one of those illustrations, didn't I? To be a neighbor to those who would see us as the Samaritan and not the Good Samaritan type. The Samaritan who is the heretic, the hated, the other. They would see us that way. And frankly, I might see them that way too. Those are the folk that we're supposed to chance caring for. You all know that Mr. Rogers was one of my heroes. And you all know the song, "Won't You Be My Neighbor?" And for Fred Rogers, that question, that whole show grew out of his commitment as a follower of Jesus. But he didn't go far enough. Actually, he did, but he didn't sing it in his song. And he went far enough in that Jesus would push not to the point of saying, "Won't you be my neighbor?" Jesus would say, "That's the wrong statement. You don't ask that question. What you say is, I'm going to be your neighbor. I'm going to be your neighbor whether you want me to or not. I'm going to be your neighbor whether you like it or not. I'm going to care, I'm going to risk, I'm going to reach out, and I'm going to be here for you." That is hard, hard, hard. For me. For me. But that's the good news of the gospel. That's the good news of the gospel. And if we are good news people, that is our call to love when it's not returned, to give without expectations, to accept and to forgive, and to offer possibilities of grace and hope and new life. I read another article this week that talked about studies that they've done looking at what Democrats think about Republicans and what Republicans think about Democrats. And the article said both groups get it entirely wrong. When you ask them, what does this person believe about this? They have an answer, and it's wrong. In both directions. And really scary, it gets more wrong the more educated you are. Part of being a neighbor is saying, you know what? I'm going to let all that go. I'm going to get to know you. I'm going to let you get to know me. Who knows what we might discover? Maybe we don't have Samaritans and Judeans anymore. Maybe we're just Baptists and Presbyterians. We can get together over some things and find a way forward. That's the good news of the gospel. Not, would you be my neighbor? But I'm going to be your neighbor. I'm going to be your neighbor. With all of the positive things that implies. Amen.